So this is the second year we are doing panels, so I guess it's a new tradition in Ember data. Sorry, at Ember Fest. Rather, so the topic of the panel will be data in Ember, so it's Ember data, but it's also other data libraries and other paradigms, recent paradigms. And I would like to start by introducing the panel members. So we have Chris, for whom it's not even 7 a.m. So thank you very much, Chris, for doing this. And he's Ember data core team member for a long time, and recently he has done a ton of work. Recently too, he has done a ton of work on Ember data, as you might have seen in the release blog posts and just on his Twitter account. And then we have Dan Gebhardt. He's the author of Rbjs, and also, I think the main author, we can say that, of Json API. And then on site with us, we have Paul Chavard, who is an Ember data alumni, you could say, core team alumni. And I think you are also a very early adopter of Orbit, and you use it quite a bit. And then we have Tomek with us, who is a staff engineer at Forest, and his team has built a very decent-sized app, I would say, that uses GraphQL. So that's all. That's all for introductions. The kind of the structure of the panel will be that we will start with what do we have now, like what the current state of each libraries and where we stand, and then we will talk about the future and what's on the roadmap for these libraries, and also what are the new trends in managing data in rich client-side applications, not just in Ember, but also like how these libraries can support these appearing paradigms. So without further ado, I think we can start by asking Chris whether, Chris, you can make like a summary of what has arrived in Ember data in recent releases. Yeah, let's just go with that first.
I think the big focus currently is just on performance. This is a focus that was unlocked by the conclusion of Project Trim, which was something that we started many years ago to kind of break Ember data apart into individual packages and to reimagine some of the internals in a way that would be more composable. The last piece of that to fall was internal model, which really held us back from doing a lot of optimization work because it kind of like had to have all these legacy behaviors to tie everything together until it was fully decomposed. So with the removal of internal model, we were able to do a pass through the library, rebuilding the internals over top of these new primitives and exposing a lot better performance characteristics. So the 4.7 release has a lot of those changes. There's still a lot more to come, but that's the big story in 4.7 is a pretty big leap in performance. 4.7 also brought better documentation to a lot of these APIs. So if you were to go to the documentation on api.emberjs.com, Ember data now has its own overview. And additionally, a lot of the APIs that we built through the 3.x series for this decomposition but hadn't documented yet now have documentation. Yeah, I guess that kind of really summarizes the recent work.
Okay, thank you. Dan, what about Orbit? Where does it stand currently?
Orbit had a version 17 release earlier this year, and it has a lot stronger, more flexible typings. It's been simplified in some ways. Some interfaces have actually been removed, which have deduped some capabilities and just really focusing on some strengths of Orbit. There are more capabilities you can get with requests and responses. You have full access to responses from different sources at the call site where you make a query or an update. So you could, if a request involves multiple sources of data, like say REST or JSON API source, you could, as well as you're querying the cache, and ultimately both sources are involved, you could, at the call site, get full access to the response document and any metadata you want out of it. There's also more control over like whether you're issuing requests in parallel or in series. So you could issue, as many query expressions in parallel as you like, and they will go out as parallel fetch requests. And then there's a bunch of new capabilities, serializers and validators, and last but not least, full API docs at orbitjs.com, and as well as the guides. So they're getting there, they're getting better.
Oh, that's really cool. What about JSON API? Is there any news on that front?
There actually is, finally. I'm excited to announce, that version 1.1 will be finalized in just over a week on September 30th. And it's been a long time coming. So thanks for those of you who have been JSON API users and have been waiting for this for literally years. So this is the first major, well, it's obviously a minor release, but it feels pretty major to me since 1.0 landed. And it includes a new way to extend the specification. JSON API extensions allow you to specify additional namespace semantics and we're launching with the first official extension, which is the atomic operations extension, which allows you to make multiple mutations in a single request, which can all reference multiple resources and relationships and all in a single request, and get back the results in a single response, and they all atomically succeed or fail. Another way, another new feature of 1.1 is our profiles. Profiles allow you to formalize your usage of the spec and share those usages. And these are not extending the spec, but really just saying how you're using it. For instance, are you paginating with cursors? Do you expect timestamps in resources? Are resources versioned? So this is a way for libraries to agree upon more specific usage of the spec. Both extensions and profiles can be added as, can be specified as media type parameters along with the JSON API media type. So so all this will be finalized in just over a week, and looking forward to hearing how it's used in the wild. So please stay in touch. We're also going to open up finally open up a Discord server for JSON API.
Oh, very nice. Thank you, Dan. So I'm turning to Tomek. The GraphQL Ember app that I mentioned, I think, was started maybe a year and a half ago, or maybe a little bit more, closer to 2 years. And we are working on it together. So I can say that we don't use Ember data. So I would just like to hear your experience about working with GraphQL, what library you chose, and
sure. First of all, I have to do something like a disclaimer. Just because we are using GraphQL, it doesn't mean you should use it. Avoid hype-driven development for sure. But you are using Ember; it's not hyped, so probably you don't have a problem with that. But for us, GraphQL works very well. We have a lot of data to load, and mostly the data sets are quite huge when you look at these modules, resources, or whatever. But often you just need a small part of that resource. So that fits very well in the GraphQL world. And also to our backend, to be honest. Huge amount of microservices, and somehow our GraphQL is able to bring them together and offer a single interface. When it comes to the client side, that's true, we didn't pick Ember data. Maybe that would change today, I don't know. Of course, we already invested time in using something else, so it's not going to be straightforward to get back. But at the time when we were shopping on GitHub, it looked like the standard, I would say, for GraphQL, Apollo, was the way to go, and that's what we picked. So far we are happy with that choice. There are some things that I would probably miss, but there is a cool add-on, and probably some of the maintainers and founders of the add-on are here, Ember Apollo client. So, of course, the Apollo library, it's like a JS library. Of course, if you look at documentation, it's all in React, which is, okay, you are an agnostic library, not a React library, right? So that's maybe some disadvantages. But yeah, that Ember Apollo client gives us the reactivity. Thing that is great for Ember data, that it integrates so well with Ember. We wouldn't have it without Ember Apollo client, so kudos to folks that are working on it. Keep working on it. So yeah, so far so good, I would say. But yeah, the main reason was like kind of, it felt at the time when we were choosing the library that it just feel easier to integrate like a JS library, not Ember data adapter or something like that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think we can now move to the future of these data solutions. So again, I would like to start with Chris. I realized there's a Quest issue for the 5.0 roadmap in Ember data, and there's a lot of checkboxes on that roadmap. Some of them are already clicked, so checked. So I was happy to see that. Could you speak a few minutes about those changes?
The rough idea behind the 5.0 for Ember data is to make it a standalone library. And the reason for that has more to do with maintenance than it does to take the library to the broader JS ecosystem, which we do want to do as a goal. But from a maintenance perspective, it's been very difficult for us to be very tightly coupled to Ember because we're so dependent on timing semantics from the core library or change notification semantics from the core library. Historically, in core classes like Ember Object and Array Proxy, it made the upgrade cycle and maintenance cycles really difficult for us. So a lot of 5.0 is removing those things so that we're built over something that's a lot easier for us to maintain. It comes with a lot of benefits. The biggest benefit is ergonomics. So for instance, in 4.7, we landed a thing where now all of those array proxies that are sort of arrays, but not really arrays. Well, they're not actual native array proxies, which means that they just act like native arrays, which is very nice. So if you've gotten programmed to using 2-array on everything to get to a native array, you won't have to do that anymore. No more push object, just use push, that sort of thing. But the other key thing about that is around scalability. What we realized over the last, 8 years of working on data and watching Redux come and go and watching Orbit's development and watching GraphQL and Apollo develop is that there is a really powerful paradigm to be had when your API schemas are very tightly coupled with your front-end schemas. And with Orbit, you typically get this out of the box with Json API, very structured data, and that's where Ember data has kind of shined a bit in the past, was if you were using Json API. And it was the reason that everything in Ember data in the past needed to be converted to JSON API was we needed to have this spec to be able to do a lot of interesting things. But we saw that, hey, there's not really one spec that's right. GraphQL has specs, they're really nice. They have schemas that are very nice. JSON API has schemas and a spec that's very nice. So why don't we create something that is flexible enough that at its core, what it's really good at is managing a cache, managing the relationships between things in that cache, and giving you a way to present that data. So a lot of the future of Ember data and a lot of what's in that roadmap is around exposing those things really as first-class primitives, so that it really doesn't matter what it is that you're using as a format. You can take your API format, you can implement a cache according to the cache spec that understands that format, and you can present it to the UI, even still in that format if you wanted to. So you don't pay these costs, for instance, of normalization, like taking a property from being underscored to camel case or from a string to a class. There's all sorts of costs that get paid today you won't have to pay anymore if you have that alignment. And I think that sets Ember data up really well for what I think the future of apps is going to be in the coming years.
When you say a standalone library, do you mean that it will be possible to integrate it with React or Vue or other frameworks?
That is our long-term goal. I think from a perspective of the source code, we will be at the point that that's possible with 5.0. From a perspective of the library still has some unique build constraints. Once we have converted to Embroider, if someone were to want to take advantage of Ember data in another ecosystem, likely what we would want to do is build like a Webpack or a rollup plugin, or maybe just a series of Babel transforms or ES build transforms that would allow any other ecosystems build chain to optimize Ember data the way that it gets optimized if you're using Ember CLI or Embroider. The reason I mentioned that is that other ecosystems don't really have a concept of macros, and Ember data relies very heavily on macros for its build to give you the best possible Ember data for your app. So for instance, we have debug logging that you can activate, but we fully remove that code if that's not activated. We have support for packages like the adapter package and the serializer package, or for the legacy model package that is there. But if you haven't installed those packages, then that code is fully removed. And we have things where the user is able to configure what deprecations that they've resolved. And if you have resolved deprecations up to a specific version, all deprecations that match that all the code that match that is automatically removed from the library. That's stuff that we can't do easily outside of the Ember build toolchain, but with Embroider and the approach that Embroider takes, we should be in a position to at least be able to offer a fairly easy configuration story for it. Hey, if you're going to use the library and you want to use the smallest possible version of this library for yourself, install this thing as well.
Nice, thank you. Dan, may I ask you about an Rbjs roadmap?
Yeah, let's see. Orbit is framework agnostic at the core, and it's built in a lot of layers. And so, of course, there are different layers that can be layered on top of lower layers. And one of them is a more document-centric rather than record-centric layer for actually processing the data, which would work better with GraphQL. It's not on my immediate roadmap, but it is something that could be introduced as on top of the core layers of Orbit. But what I am doing in a framework agnostic way right now is working on a model layer, which essentially moves a lot of the model specific features from Ember Orbit up into framework agnostic Orbit model layer, which could then be used with other frameworks. And I'm looking to also make the querying and mutation even more extensible, so that you can literally plug in any kind of query expression and mutation into your queries and updates. And so this should allow should be a good basis for finally getting to 1.0, having this level of flexibility. And then keeping the reactive layers on top, like Ember Orbit, as thin as possible, as thin as they can be, so that most of the good parts, as are the interesting parts about Orbit, are in the core library.
I see. Thank you. So, what are the kind of the emerging paradigms in this space in rich client-side apps, and how they, manage and access data? What would you say those are? We can start by Chris or Dan. Dan, go ahead.
Go ahead, Dan.
I don't. How about Paul? Yeah,
I was just thinking this.
Because Paul's actually worked in a number of different frameworks and with different data layers. Do you mind if I put you on the spot?
I think, like it was already said here, I think it's very interesting to me idea is that indeed there are multiple paradigms that come to data loading. I would argue that today there is maybe some people who try to say that there is one solution that fits all the bills, but I don't think it's the case. I haven't seen one especially for that loading, because I think there is a very wide range of expectation and trade-offs. For example, if you're building a real-time app, or if you want it to be offline, or if you're building an app which is mostly, you actually know that you always have the server, like, I don't know, if you're building a dashboard which is mostly used in an office. All of those are very different from data perspective, and if you want to combine all of those things in one piece of software, I haven't seen it actually working. Just, for example, combine offline, like there are solutions to do offline, there are solutions to do real time. Combining both becomes insanely complex. We're basically talking CRDT level of integration and very hard constraints of managing memory on the client and like the history. And so I'm not going to go there, but just to give it like that, there is this case where you really need to look at what actually is your core requirement. And I don't think that your answer will vary depending on that. When I started working on Orbit, helping Dan, I was interested in offline solutions. So this is what brought me to Orbit, because I felt at the point it was quite aligned, this idea. On the opposite side, GraphQL, for example, I know there are like some attempts at making work offline, but I think it's quite hard to make it work offline because of, well, you can run the schema on the client, but it means that you're loading a very, very big bundle of JavaScript, which wasn't really designed. I mean, you can do it, but it clearly wasn't initially designed for that, and make it, because you need the whole engine to execute the queries on the client. It's really not, it's a trade-off, obviously. But yeah, and synchronizing it, because GraphQL cache can be quite, it's not necessarily normalized. So again, synchronizing cache can be quite challenging. So yeah, given all that, it's, and then there is obviously a last paradigm that I think really interesting, and I feel like there's maybe a bit of missed opportunity there in Emberland, is like full stack frameworks like Next, Nuxt, SvelteKit, or Remix more recently, which basically say, why do we have front end on one side and back end on the other? Why can't we have both? And it's kind of a very old idea, right? We're going back to the days of glory of Rails and Django, and well, which is still very, very much present, but like the idea that why do I have to have two apps? Why can't I build my whole app together? And then again, your data loading will be quite different. I think this one obviously falls into the pattern where you say, yeah, I'm fine, I always have network. And but if it's your case, it's going to work beautifully, I think, and it removes a lot of complexity. So, but again, it's you will have other trade-offs to do, like maybe some performance, depending again on what kind of app you're building. So yeah, my message would be just look very closely on your app, and you will have to make a choice until someone comes up with some miracle technology which will solve it all, maybe one day.
That's a good message. Chris, you raise your hand while Paul is talking.
Yeah, I would love to tack on to that, which is I've been thinking hard about what the next few years for Ember Data looks like. And really, to answer that question, I had to ask what do the next few years of building apps look like. I really think SSR is the driving story here, that we have seen this rise of new frameworks like Remix and like Next, like SvelteKit, where are really SSR first, and sometimes SSR preferred. And none of the data libraries out there right now really feel like they fit that paradigm well, but I think that Ember Data could. And the reason for that is entirely in that alignment of, can you align your API models to your cache, to your presentation? If you have that alignment, then the patterns that Ember Data encourages, which for fetch, which today is that adapter pattern, but in the near future is going to be the middleware pattern, which is only slightly different in all the ways. What happens is in SSR mode, you just swap that middleware out for something that is doing a more direct fetch of your data versus necessarily relying on HTTP. You basically are giving yourself an SSR mode for data fetch. And the resulting data, when it's pushed into the cache, even if you had to do a little bit of transformation, if you're pretty close to the data that was being sent, going to be sent back over the wire, because the cache in Ember Data is now fully serializable, and because all state in Ember Data now derives from the cache, you just dump the cache into the shoebox instead of dumping requests into the shoebox. And so the cache just becomes something it's almost just an object assigned to restore it, to bring it back. So you have this really inexpensive restore for when you want to rehydrate later. And so it gives you what I think this solves specifically is the case where you want to build an app that is SSR heavy, but you also have a large amount of data that you want to be able to interact with and manage once you have that application booted and running. That's the story I don't think I see Remix and Next and SvelteKit solving very well today, is once you have the app running, if you have a lot of data that you want to be interacting with, what do you do? And I think to couple with that is, I think we should see some experimentation in Fastboot with a kind of a data-only fetching mode, where we only render a subset of components and only render, which are provider components, and only render your routes. And we basically use that to build the data response. And so that you could not just do SSR to get your initial payload, but you could actually run SSR in this other mode just to get the next cache state for a specific request. So if you wanted to not do all the rendering, but you wanted to get all the data ready in a worker or something like that for the next page you wanted to go to, you get that serialized state sent back to you. It's sitting there in say, a web worker. That's a fairly cheap transfer out of a web worker, since it's very serializable in either as structured cloning algorithm or as JSON stringify. So it gives you this ability to just kind of patch the cache at runtime for a whole nother route to be entered. So I really want to see, not just in Ember Data, I really want to see Orbit and Apollo and really just these libraries that historically have been here for a richer, interactive, more app-like data experience, focus more on how they can do a really good job with SSR. It just feels like that's that.
I really think that that approach works well for a lot of apps, and maybe in the Ember world we've primarily focused on the rich client side, But I have written apps which that use fast food and the shoebox to transfer JSON to a client-side cache. I think that's a great approach. I've done that with Remix as well and React, and loading that data on the server side to do the server side rendering, and then sending it down if I want that in the cache for rich client-side interactions. That does work well. It's a great fit for a lot of types of apps. So it's I think that the application's needs can drive these choices, like that as Paul Hall's thesis was. I think that's spot on. And I think libraries like Orbit and Ember data and need to evolve to fit many patterns, or I mean, some of them we don't have to be the answer to everything too. That's also important to realize. But I think that there are a lot of patterns that work well for different types of apps, and we need the data libraries need to adapt to fit those patterns. And I think there's a whole wave of new patterns coming out that are a mix of old and new, and it is exciting. Some things I'd love to see to support better data loading from say from Ember with routing would be the ability to fetch, to eliminate the waterfall fetch effect, and to prefetch better with in parallel, do things like that for rehydrating pages as quickly as possible. So there's work that can be done in data libraries, and there's work that can be done in the frameworks to better enable those capabilities. And I think we all learn from each other in this regard.
Yeah, thank you. I think we should start with the questions, right?
So about the kind of future stuff, right? Was it ever a consideration to, let's say, make an Rbjs like the main citizen for the Ember stuff, instead of kind of rolling on with Ember data and trying to evolve it?
I don't know. You want to take this, Dan, or I'll take?
I guess I gave a talk a few years ago at EmberConf, and I pushed for either Orbit to be directly embedded in Ember data, but perhaps a better solution, and one that I pushed harder on, was for Ember data to be flexible enough to be potentially a wrapper on top of Orbit, but not exclusively Orbit, because there are some features of Orbit that I don't think Ember data should necessarily try to reinvent, like the immutable cache, which allows for store forking and mutations that can be just discarded or committed. And there's a lot of work that went into that, and I don't know if it's valuable to reinvent that. But I think Ember data is a more general library, and I think the direction Chris and others want to take it is perhaps as flexible, is more flexible, and maybe not quite as deep, and hopefully more pluggable too. So I'll hand it off to you, Chris. That's my take on it.
There's been a lot of general direction alignment between Orbit and Ember data for a long time, for good reason, because Orbit really paved the road for us in a lot of areas. I think the general conclusion that folks kind of came away with on it was making Orbit capable of being Ember data's cache was a good thing. Making Ember data Orbit was a bad thing. And it's not that Orbit is bad when I say that. It's that Orbit, at least at that time, did not quite fit what we thought needed to be there for the flexibility perspective. Interestingly, because all these things come full circle, one of those complaints that I had was that Orbit was very resource-centric, and I could see that the future was going to be very document-centric in the cache. GraphQL was headed that way, and I could see even with JSON API that we were losing a lot of valuable information by not preserving the wrappers at the top level of these requests that we were getting back in responses. And so Dan mentioning that, hey, Orbit is now exploring a cache that is more document-centric, like we continue to just really almost be running in parallel now, where what the defining difference is probably going to end up being in the long run is, do you want these features around logging, replay, offline behaviors, multiple tiered caches? There's a lot of stuff that Orbit has that's really awesome that doesn't necessarily make sense for all apps. And so as that alignment continues to come together, just an easy Ember data to Orbit integration is probably still like in the cards.
I think I would say a goal that perhaps would make everyone in this room happy, including us, would be to empower Ember data to be able to replace Ember Orbit. And so that if Ember data is capable enough to wrap Orbit and provide the full Ember reactivity layer that that's needed in an Ember app, then Ember Orbit could go away. And I'm not saying that Orbit would be the only integration with Ember data, but if Ember data could do that and fully replace Ember Orbit, I think it would simplify the ecosystem and it would simplify our choices. So that's still like a long-term goal for me to get these projects aligned in that way. So that's my hope.
There is a question on Zoom.
Yes, I think this one is for Paul. Somebody had potential inspiration, and I'm going to quote, "I frequently thought it to be an interesting approach to provide rather static / less frequently updated data in a prepackaged WebAssembly package. Would something like this be an idea for be built in Think, Build, and SSR?" I think it's some like, yeah, I think the idea was to prepackage things like data in a WebAssembly way.
Maybe. Maybe. I mean, WebAssembly. To be fair, like I don't know much about WebAssembly. I don't know if it's if data loading is and just general data processing is something which will benefit. This will be the first thing that will benefit from WebAssembly. This would be the first question I would ask. Is it really like? I'm kind of tempted to maybe point at Transpired, who is more of a perf expert, because it sounds like would actually run some data processing in WebAssembly get something. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's an unexplored space, but it's one of those things that sounds good in theory and not super sure it's going to work out in practice. I think where we might see some, or actually we are starting to see some pretty interesting WebAssembly exploration in the data side is the shipping of full DB implementations written in WebAssembly. I think you're probably going to start seeing even more of that. It's whether this turns out to be a good thing or a bad thing in the long run. I don't know. I'm not going to try to prognosticate that. What I do find interesting about it is that for all of the work that the ecosystem is doing to try to ship less JS, we're at the same time starting to think about shipping much larger WebAssembly packages. And that's going to have some interesting ramifications, I think, that will kind of come back around.
But indeed, it reminds me there is this announcement, I think it was from Google, that said that they plan to remove completely web SQL, but kind of to give people a lifeline. they're promising that there will be a build of SQLite in WebAssembly, which will run in browsers. So it's quite interesting that this is the road they went, because it's been years that some people were like complaining that if they remove WebSQL would be like, even though it was deprecated years ago, it's still some people use it. But yeah, it's an interesting perspective. I don't know how it's going to turn.
Hi, I don't use Ember data or Rbjs, sorry. But my question is maybe dumb, but how Ember resources gonna impact all those solutions regarding the Ember application?
I think that what you're asking is the resource pattern, like for kind of async management. Am I understanding that question right?
Yes.
Okay. As far as Ember data goes, I think they're just complementary. Like there's a lot of places components probably are going to want to fetch data. I think the same is probably true for Orbit and Apollo, especially because something that I haven't talked about a lot, but which is going to turn into an encouraged pattern in Ember data in the future, is actually bringing the query to the front. So right now the adapter builds the query. This doesn't work well for all paradigms, and in GraphQL it actually works much nicer if at the call site of where you're issuing the query is where the query is built. For various build time optimizations, hoisting it out, replacing it with IDs, that sort of thing. So I think you'll even, the way to start thinking about Ember data's fetching story is really that it's just an abstraction over fetch, and it's going to look a lot like just issuing a request a bit more normally, just gives you a richer response. And I think that that's kind of similar for the Apollo story, where it really is in a lot of ways kind of a fetch with a recipe. Both of those really just play to resources quite well, I think. So I don't think it's something that replaces. It's something that enhances.
Okay.
I can confirm on our side we are using resources with Apollo. Works pretty well. I'm happy to hear from Chris that we are heading more into that queries approach. However, it's weird it sounds about data management. Kind of for me now, the data is secondary. The first thing is the request itself, what works pretty well in Apollo. Kind of you cache the queries, right? So queries can be, of course, different with filters or whatever, lists with filters. So this is a change, and hearing that it's going to change in Ember data, it's also a good thing, I think. It will give us much more power, I believe. And yeah, actually for GraphQL, we previously found that power only in Apollo, but yeah, looks like future is bright.
Chris, this is a question for you, because you're going to plug how great Ember Data 4.7 is. There's a question about what should be monitored to see the performance improvements.
It really depends on what your app is doing as to which improvements in that release are going to be the biggest win for you. So if your app does something like, hey, I'm trying to do a lot of cache management and do a lot of unloading, what I've seen a lot of people try to do in the past is try to like iterate a loop and call unload record or something like that. Those sorts of scenarios, you will see just almost 100x speed up. I think it's 98%, which comes out at like 95x or 96x as a speed up. If you're in your test suite, that's where you're definitely going to see one of the biggest wins, because every single test that sets up the store and populates the store has to unload the store at the end of the test suite. We've essentially made that as free as possible. And that is almost, again, like almost 100x speed up. So in what I noticed is that like a lot of acceptance tests were taking 30 to 40% less time just because that setup was gone. or that teardown was gone from the end of the test. Relationships are the other big place that you're going to see a lot of improvement, especially async relationships, but this is true for relationships generally. If you're pushing a lot of related data into the cache, you should notice that if you were to do it, if you were to just open up the profiler and dig around and see, in the profile trace what shows up, you should see that things like setup relationships be in the call stack. You should see those blocks be a lot smaller. Similarly, you should see calls to push internal model, which will not exist anymore because there is no internal model. But where that work was all underneath a method called push, where you will see that in the trace. That should be significantly faster. The biggest way to measure this is just if you have really good RUM tracking already in place in your app. I would expect that on routes that you're loading any data of any consequence, a couple hundred records at least, that you would be able to observe a similar size improvement for the scenario that matches what we put in the release notes.
Thank you once more very much, both to our remote members and the on-site members. Thank you very much.